There is a room in Chicago's Northwestern Memorial Hospital where, at 2:47 in the morning, the most gifted thoracic surgeon in the state stood over his own wife's body. Her heart had stopped. Her living will was in the system. Her DNR bracelet was on her wrist. Every nurse on the floor knew her wishes. Every resident, every attending, every single protocol written into her chart said the same thing: let her go. And Julian Mercer, who had honored this directive in writing, in conversation, in whispered promises made on their anniversary while holding her hands in his, picked up a scalpel instead. He didn't save her life that night. He ended it, just not in the way you think. To understand what Julian destroyed, you first have to understand what Julian and Elena built. They met in the autumn of 2011 at a fundraiser for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Julian was 34, already the youngest department lead in his hospital's history. He had a reputation for calm under pressure that bordered on unsettling, the kind of surgeon who could crack a joke during a 9-hour thoracotomy and still deliver textbook precision on every single suture. Colleagues called him the constant. He never wavered. He never panicked. He never, ever lost control. Elena Vassiliev was 29, a first-chair violinist whose interpretation of Shostakovich's Violin Concerto No. 1 had once made a New York Times critic use the word devastating 3 times in a single review. She was born in St. Petersburg, raised in Montreal, and had been playing since the age of 4. The kind of prodigy whose relationship with her instrument was less a skill and more a second circulatory system. Music didn't flow through Elena. Elena flowed through music. The night they met, Julian confessed he knew nothing about classical music. Elena laughed and said, "Good, then you will hear it honestly." Their courtship was the kind people write novels about. He would leave surgeries and drive across the city, through traffic, through rainstorms, through his own exhaustion, just to catch the final movement of her performances. She would sit in the observation gallery above his operating theater, watching his hands work with the same precision she demanded of her own. They recognized something in each other, a shared fluency in discipline, in devotion to craft, in the belief that the hands could accomplish what words could not. "We spoke the same language," Julian would later tell a colleague. "Hers was just more beautiful." They married in the spring of 2013 in a small ceremony at the Chicago Botanic Garden. For 5 years, they were the couple that made other couples feel like they were settling. Not because they were perfect. Elena was fiercely independent, sometimes to the point of emotional coldness, and Julian carried a savior complex that colleagues whispered about long before it consumed him. But because their imperfections interlocked, she gave him something worthy to orbit around. He gave her a safe place to land when the world demanded too much of her perfection. They talked about children. They looked at houses in Vermont for eventual retirement. They built a future in conversation the way architects build cathedrals in blueprint, with faith that the structure would hold. Then, in the autumn of 2018, Elena's left hand began to tremor. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight unevenness in her vibrato during rehearsal, a bow that didn't track as smoothly across the strings during passages she had played flawlessly 1,000 times. Her conductor noticed before she admitted it to herself. Her neurologist confirmed it before Julian could process the possibility. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, and not the slow-burning kind. For those unfamiliar, ALS, sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease, is a progressive neurodegenerative condition that systematically attacks the motor neurons, the specialized nerve cells responsible for every voluntary muscle movement your body makes: walking, speaking, swallowing, breathing, lifting a cup, turning a page. The mind, cruelly, almost always remains completely untouched. Cognition stays sharp, Awareness stays vivid. You don't fade. You watch yourself vanish from the inside, fully conscious, fully present, fully trapped. There is no cure. There is no reversal. There are medications that can slow the progression, riluzole, edaravone, but they buy months, not years. They adjust the tempo of the decline. They do not change the composition. Elena's form was particularly aggressive, a rapidly progressive variant that her neurologist, Dr. Amara Osai, estimated would follow a functional timeline of 3 to 5 years. The muscles in her extremities would weaken first. Fine motor control, the kind required to hold a bow with calibrated pressure, to press fingertips against strings with the precision of millimeters, to coax beauty from wood and wire, would be among the earliest casualties. The disease would take her music before it took her breath, and Elena knew exactly what that meant. She absorbed this diagnosis the way she absorbed difficult music, with total stillness, followed by total clarity. There were no hysterics, no bargaining, no desperate late-night searches for miracle treatments. Elena had spent her life mastering the art of interpreting what was written on the page in front of her, and this diagnosis was simply the final score. Within 6 weeks, she had drafted a comprehensive advance directive. Within 8, it was signed, notarized, and filed with 3 separate institutions. The document was explicit and unambiguous. If Elena could no longer play her violin, if the instrument that had defined her identity, her purpose, and her sense of self since the age of 4 was permanently taken from her, she did not wish to be resuscitated. She did not wish to be placed on mechanical ventilation. She did not wish to be sustained by extraordinary measures of any kind. Her DNR was not a document of despair. It was not written in darkness or depression. Her psychiatric evaluation confirmed decisional capacity. It was, in her own words, the last piece of music I will ever compose. It was a final exercise of autonomy, the foundational bioethical principle that every competent adult has the sovereign, inviolable right to determine what happens to their own body. Julian signed as witness. His hand was steady. He understood, or he believed he did. Here is where the story enters territory that most people can't afford to talk about honestly. And if this kind of unflinching, deeply human storytelling resonates with you, consider subscribing to this channel, because we believe the hardest human stories are the ones most worth telling carefully. Over the next 2 years, Julian became Elena's primary caregiver. He adjusted his surgical schedule, reducing his caseload by nearly 40%. He learned to administer her medications with the same meticulousness he applied in the operating room. He researched every clinical trial, every experimental therapy, every thread of hope the global medical community could offer. And slowly, invisibly, imperceptibly at first, something inside him began to corrode. Psychologists who study long-term caregiving call it compassion fatigue, but that clinical term is far too clean, too sterile for what Julian experienced. What he felt was something darker, something that lived in the silence between his public devotion and his private thoughts, something he could never say aloud to anyone. There were nights, he admitted this later in a personal journal that was never meant to be read by another human being, when he resented Elena. Not for being sick, never for being sick. He resented her for being certain, for having made peace with her own ending when he could not find peace with anything, for possessing a clarity about her death that made his desperate, grasping love feel small by comparison. She has her directive, he wrote in March of 2020. She has her plan. Her ending is composed, rehearsed, and ready. I have nothing. I am supposed to just stand in the room and watch the greatest person I have ever known disappear, and I am supposed to call that love. I am supposed to call that enough. He wrote about what therapists sometimes refer to as the fantasy of after. Not a fantasy of freedom, not a fantasy of relief or escape, but an unbearable recurring imagining of the silence that would follow after she is gone. The apartment without the sound of her practicing, the closet still full of her concert dresses, the custom violin case in the corner of their bedroom that no one would ever open again. He wrote about the guilt of imagining a second life, not wanting it, but being unable to stop his mind from constructing it, a future that felt like betrayal simply for existing in his thoughts. Julian wasn't mourning Elena's demise, he was mourning the future he had been promised, the children they'd discussed in detail, the house in Vermont with the wide porch, the decades of growing old together that ALS had repossessed without negotiation, without appeal, without mercy. And when you mourn a future, when grief arrives before the passing away of a loved one does and settles into your bones like a second skeleton, you become capable of something questionable. You become capable of stealing it back. By late 2021, Elena could no longer play. Her left hand had atrophied to the point where she could not reliably form even a simple chord. Her bowing arm fatigued after 30 seconds of sustained effort. The muscle wasting was visible now, her forearms thinner, her grip unreliable. The once powerful architecture of a performer's hands reduced to something fragile and uncertain. She gave her final private performance, Brahms' Violin Sonata No. 3 in D minor, played with hesitations and imprecisions she would have once found unforgivable, in their living room on a Sunday evening for an audience of one. Julian sat on the couch 3 feet away and did not breathe for the duration of the first movement. The performance lasted 11 minutes. It contained everything she had ever been and everything she was losing, all at once. Julian recorded it on his phone. He has never been able to watch it back. 3 months later, on a Tuesday night in February of 2022, Elena suffered a sudden cardiac event while sleeping. ALS-related respiratory compromise had been progressively weakening her cardiac function for months. Her diaphragm was losing the battle. Her heart entered an arrhythmia, then ventricular fibrillation, then asystole. Flatline. The overnight critical care team followed protocol precisely. They checked her chart, they verified her code status, they saw the DNR, clearly documented, legally unassailable, psychiatrically validated. They stepped back from the bed. They called Julian as next of kin. He had been on call in the same hospital 4 floors below. He reached her room in under 4 minutes, still in his surgical coat, still wearing his operating loops pushed up on his forehead. And what happened next remains one of the most ethically debated incidents in the hospital's modern history. Julian overrode the DNR. Not through the proper bureaucratic channels, not through an emergency legal petition, not through any mechanism the system recognizes, through force of presence. He was the most senior surgeon in the building at that hour. He commanded the room with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in moments of crisis. He ordered the team to begin resuscitation immediately, and when a charge nurse objected, firmly, professionally, citing Elena's explicit, legally binding, clearly documented wishes, Julian reportedly said 5 words that would later appear verbatim in the hospital's formal ethics board inquiry. "She is my wife. Move." He then performed a series of emergency cardiac interventions that escalated beyond standard resuscitation, culminating in an experimental cardiac stabilization technique he had been privately researching for months, a procedure that had never received approval for clinical use in human patients, a procedure whose animal trial data carried a documented and significant risk of peripheral and autonomic nerve damage. He performed it on his own wife, without her consent, in direct, knowing violation of her advance directive, because he could not, would not, stand in a world where she did not exist. At 3:12 a.m., 25 minutes after the flatline began, Elena's heart resumed a stable sinus rhythm. Julian had brought her back. The room was silent except for the beeping of the monitor. The nursing staff would not meet his eyes. Elena survived. Her brain remarkably showed no significant hypoxic damage. The resuscitation window, though prolonged, had been managed with sufficient oxygenation throughout. But the experimental procedure Julian had performed, the unauthorized cardiac stabilization, combined with the existing progressive neurodegeneration of her ALS, caused catastrophic peripheral nerve damage throughout both upper extremities. Before the cardiac event, Elena had retained partial, meaningful use of her hands, enough to write legibly, enough to feed herself with modified utensils, enough to turn the pages of a book, to brush her own hair on good days, to maintain the fragments of physical independence that constituted her remaining dignity. After Julian's intervention, even those fragments were taken. Her fine motor function was effectively destroyed. The hands that had once drawn sound from a violin like pulling silk through still water, the hands that had made audiences weep and critics reach for words they didn't normally use, could now barely close around a pen. Julian had not merely ignored her wish to not be resuscitated on her own terms. He had, in the very process of saving her, systematically eliminated the last physical capabilities she had still valued. He had violated her autonomy, the most fundamental right to choose the story of her own body, and in doing so, had delivered precisely the outcome she had most explicitly, most clearly, most desperately feared. She was alive. She could not play. And now she could not even hold the instrument she had been willing to die beside. The hospital launched a formal ethics review within 72 hours. Julian was immediately suspended from clinical duties pending investigation. The legal questions were labyrinthine and without clear precedent: a spouse overriding a DNR, a physician performing an unapproved experimental procedure on an immediate family member, the tangled intersection of marital authority, medical licensing, and patient autonomy. Bioethicists were consulted, legal scholars debated jurisdiction. The case was discussed in academic journals before it ever reached a courtroom. But the legal consequences, whatever they might eventually be, were nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what happened between them in the weeks that followed. For 3 weeks after regaining consciousness, after being told what had happened and what had been done to her and by whom, Elena did not speak to Julian. Not out of incapacity. Her speech, though weakened by disease progression, was still functional. She spoke to her nurses. She spoke to Dr. Osei. She responded to the physical therapists who assessed her diminished capabilities with the same stoic precision she had brought to everything in her life. She simply did not speak to Julian. Not a word. Not a glance when he entered the room. Not an acknowledgement of his presence when he sat in the chair beside her bed for hours, waiting. The silence was not passive. It was architectural. It was a wall she constructed deliberately, methodically, with the only building materials she had left: her will and her choice. The two things Julian had proven he did not respect. Then, one afternoon in late March, a nurse delivered a single folded piece of paper to Julian's temporary office on a different floor. Elena had spent 4 days writing it. 4 days of painstaking, exhausting effort, guiding a pen with both damaged hands pressed together, her handwriting barely legible, each letter a monument of physical will and emotional control. The nurses who witnessed the writing process later said they had never seen anyone fight so hard to commit so few words to paper. Julian opened the letter expecting rage, expecting accusation, expecting the searing, justified words he had been rehearsing responses to for weeks, the anger he knew he deserved and had been bracing for like a surgeon braces for a difficult case. Instead, he found 4 sentences. "Thank you for showing me who you loved. It was never me. It was your idea of me. I am releasing you from the obligation of pretending otherwise." Julian read it once as a goodbye. Then he read it again as an accusation. Then he read it a 3rd time, and he understood what it actually was. It was not anger. It was not forgiveness. It was not grief or bitterness or even disappointment. It was severance. Complete, total, irreversible emotional severance. Elena was not leaving him in fury. Fury would have meant she still cared enough to burn. She was excising him with the same clean, deliberate precision he had once used to save strangers' lives and had ultimately used to dismantle hers. She was telling him, calmly, clearly, with the composure of a woman who had spent her life mastering performances under impossible pressure, that his act of rescue was never about her. It was about his inability to exist without the role of loving her. He hadn't saved Elena. He had saved his identity as Elena's husband. He had preserved the version of himself that mattered to him, the devoted partner, the tireless protector, the man who would do anything. And in doing so, he had proven that her autonomy, her selfhood, her fundamental right to choose her own ending had never actually been sacred to him. It had only ever been tolerated, right up until the moment it cost him something. The word thank you was the most devastating element of the letter, because it was sincere. She was genuinely, honestly grateful, not for the resuscitation, for the clarity. Grateful to finally understand with total certainty that the man she had trusted with her will had always, always valued his own emotional survival above her dignity. Julian resigned from his position 4 months later. The ethics board ultimately issued a formal censure, and his clinical privileges were permanently restricted. Criminal charges were considered but not pursued. The legal framework around spousal DNR overrides remains, to this day, agonizingly ambiguous, caught between the rights of patients, the authority of families, and the obligations of physicians who happen to be both. Elena was transferred to a specialized long-term care facility that focused on neurodegenerative conditions. She accepted full palliative support. She did not need to update her advance directive. Everyone, every doctor, every nurse, every administrator in the system now understood her wishes, with a clarity that required no document. Julian visits every Sunday. Elena permits it. She has never asked him not to come, and she has never asked him to stay longer. They do not speak of that night. They do not speak of the procedure, or the letter, or the life they had built and the way it ended. They do not speak of much at all. He sits in a chair by the window while the afternoon light moves slowly across the room, and he watches her watch the patterns it makes on the ceiling. Sometimes he brings flowers. She looks at them the way you look at something that belongs to a language you no longer speak. And Julian understands, with the kind of understanding that arrives too late to save anything, the kind that illuminates the wreckage without offering a single tool to repair it, that love without respect for the beloved's own choices is not love at all. It is just possession wearing a gentler name. A colleague once asked Julian, months after everything, if he regretted what he did that night. He paused for a very long time, long enough that the colleague thought he might not answer. "I don't regret trying to save her," he said finally. "I regret that I was the kind of man who believed saving her was my decision to make." This story asks us to sit with questions that resist comfortable answers, questions that follow you out of the room and settle into the quiet moments of your day. Where does love end and control begin? Is there a boundary? And if so, who draws it? The one who loves or the one who is loved? When we fight to keep someone alive against their clearly stated wishes, whose life are we actually saving? Theirs or our own? And is there any form of betrayal more complete, more total, more difficult to forgive than the betrayal committed in the name of absolute devotion? The 4 pillars of medical bioethics, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, exist because medicine learned, through centuries of painful, costly, deeply human lessons, that good intentions are not the same thing as good actions, that the road to harm is most often paved by people who believed, sincerely and completely, that they were helping. Autonomy is not a suggestion. It is not a guideline to be followed when convenient and overridden when the stakes feel personal enough. It is the recognition that every human being, even a dying one, especially a dying one, is the author of their own story. Not their spouse, not their doctor, not the person who loves them most in the world. Them. Julian Mercer was not a villain. He was a man who loved someone so completely, so consumingly, that he forgot she was a person with her own sovereignty and not a project for his devotion. His sin was not malice. It was the arrogance of believing that his love gave him authority over her life. And Elena Vassiliev was not a tragedy. She was not a cautionary tale or a passive victim. She was a woman who knew exactly who she was and what her life meant. A woman whose identity was forged in discipline and expressed through art, and whose greatest, most precise, most unforgettable performance was a 4-sentence letter written with hands that could barely hold a pen. She played that final piece perfectly. Now, I want to ask you directly, because this is not the kind of story that should end without honest reflection. What would you have done at 2:47 in the morning if the person you loved most in this world was lying in front of you and the document said, "Let go," and your hands knew how to bring them back? Would you have honored the paper, or would you have reached for the scalpel? There is no right answer, but there is an honest one. And it might tell you something about yourself that you have never had to confront. Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who is caring for a loved one, someone who is navigating these impossible questions in real time, someone who needs to know they are not alone in the darkness of these choices. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Every story on this channel is built on a single foundational belief that the deepest truth of who we are is revealed not in our finest moments, not in our public victories or our rehearsed virtues, but in our most desperate ones, in the moments when love and selfishness become indistinguishable, in the choices we make when no one is watching, or when everyone is watching and we no longer care, in the moments between us. This has been The Last Note. Thank you for staying until the very end.